A pregnant woman collapses in divorce court while her husband's mistress smiles from the gallery, thinking she's about to witness total victory. But they have no idea what's in the sealed envelope the judge is holding. A DNA test that won't just reveal the father of the baby, but will unravel lies that built an entire empire. What happens next will shock you and prove that sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the sweetest revenge. If you love stories of justice and triumph, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true-to-life dramas. Let's begin. The air in courtroom 4B felt thick enough to choke on. Sarah Mitchell pressed her palms against the polished wooden table, trying to steady herself as another wave of nausea rolled through her 8-month pregnant body. The morning sickness had supposedly ended months ago, but stress had a way of bringing back all the unpleasant symptoms of early pregnancy. Across the sterile courtroom, her husband Brandon sat perfectly composed beside his high-priced attorney, his designer suit crisp and his jaw set with cold determination. David Peterson was known throughout Silicon Valley as the lawyer you hired when you wanted to destroy someone completely and legally. His reputation for ruthless tactics and courtroom theatrics made him worth every penny of his $1,000 hourly rate. But it wasn't Brandon that made Sarah's stomach turn. It wasn't even the knowledge that she was about to be publicly humiliated in front of reporters who'd been following their high-profile divorce. It was the woman sitting directly behind him in the gallery. Amber Vance looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders in perfect waves that had clearly been professionally styled for this moment. She wore a tight red dress that screamed confidence and victory, a deliberate choice that violated every unwritten rule of courtroom decorum. Her lips were curved in a small, knowing smile that seemed to say, "I've already won, and now I get to watch you lose everything." That smile was aimed directly at Sarah, a silent taunt that felt more devastating than any words could have been. "Your Honor," Peterson stood with practiced authority, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from never having lost a case this public. "My client has serious doubts about the paternity of the child Mrs. Mitchell is carrying. He believes she has been unfaithful during their marriage and is now attempting to use this pregnancy to secure an undeserved financial settlement." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one carefully crafted to inflict maximum damage. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of supporting Brandon's dreams, building his company, sacrificing her own career aspirations. And this was how it ended, with lies and accusations in a sterile courtroom while his mistress watched with satisfaction, probably already planning how to redecorate the house Sarah had helped design. Judge Rebecca Stone, a stern woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, looked over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who'd seen every form of human ugliness in her courtroom. "Mr. Peterson, these are serious allegations. What evidence does your client have to support this claim of infidelity?" "We have formally requested a court-ordered DNA test, Your Honor. The results should speak for themselves and reveal the truth about this child's parentage." Sarah's attorney, Marcus Thompson, stood immediately, his own reputation for protecting wrong spouses preceding him into the courtroom. "Your Honor, my client has already agreed to the test. The results were delivered to this court this morning. We're prepared to have them read into the record immediately." A flicker of surprise crossed Peterson's carefully composed face. They hadn't expected this level of cooperation. They'd expected Sarah to fight, to delay, to look guilty and desperate. Instead, she'd met their challenge head-on with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. From her seat in the gallery, Amber leaned forward slightly, her predatory blue eyes fixed on the judge's bench where a single sealed envelope lay waiting. The smile never left her face, but Sarah could see the intensity behind it, the hungry anticipation of someone about to witness their rival's complete destruction. Judge Stone picked up the envelope, her gaze sweeping the room with the authority of someone who controlled the fate of everyone present. "The court has in its possession the results of the DNA analysis comparing samples from the fetus and Mr. Brandon Mitchell." The silence was absolute, so complete that Sarah could hear the soft whirring of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of traffic outside. Each tick was a countdown to either vindication or devastation, and everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that she was sure everyone could hear. She knew the truth. Of course, the baby was Brandon's, but after months of systematic gaslighting and psychological warfare, she'd begun to doubt her own reality. her own memories, her own perceptions of what had happened in her marriage. She looked across the room at Brandon, searching for any flicker of the man she'd once loved. His face was a mask of cold indifference, as if he were watching a mildly interesting business presentation rather than the destruction of his family. When their eyes met for a brief moment, she saw nothing. No love, no regret, no recognition of the woman who had stood by him through every challenge, every setback, every triumph. He was a stranger wearing her husband's face, but it was Amber's expression that finally broke her. As the judge began to tear open the seal on the envelope, Amber's lips curved into that same vicious, triumphant smile. It was the smile of someone who believed they were about to watch their rival's complete destruction, who had already started mentally spending the money they thought they'd won. The room began to tilt. The judge's voice became distant and echoing, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. Black spots danced at the edges of Sarah's vision, growing larger with each heartbeat. She felt the baby give a sharp kick, as if sensing the distress coursing through her body. Her hand, which had been gripping the table so tightly her knuckles had turned white, slipped. Marcus turned, his professional composure vanishing in an instant. But Sarah couldn't answer. The floor rushed up to meet her as the world dissolved into suffocating darkness. Her last conscious thought was of that smile, burned into her mind like a brand, and the terrible realization that this was exactly what they'd wanted all along. The pregnant woman had fainted in court, and the mistress was still smiling. 3 years earlier, the world had been painted in brilliant colors. Sarah remembered the exact moment Brandon had proposed, standing in their favorite coffee shop in downtown San Jose, the one where they'd had their first date after meeting at a tech networking event. He'd been nervous, fumbling with the small velvet box as early morning commuters rushed past the windows, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their phones. "We're going to build something incredible together, Sarah," he'd said, his eyes bright with the kind of possibility that made Silicon Valley the center of the technological universe. "You handle the marketing. I'll handle the tech. We'll be unstoppable. We'll change the world." And for a while they did. Next-gen solutions started in their cramped garage. Like all the great Silicon Valley stories that became legend, Sarah's marketing brilliance combined with Brandon's coding skills created something special, something that felt destined for greatness. Their app, which helped small businesses optimize their supply chains using artificial intelligence and predictive analytics, gained traction quickly among beta testers who couldn't stop raving about its potential. Within 18 months, they'd moved to a proper office in a converted warehouse in downtown San Jose, hired their first 5 employees, and caught the attention of major investors who saw dollar signs in their revolutionary approach to supply chain management. The meetings with venture capitalists felt like auditions for a better life, and Sarah and Brandon performed their roles perfectly. Sarah thrived in those early days. She was the face of the company, the one who could translate Brandon's technical vision into language that investors and customers understood. Her campaigns were creative, effective, and brought in millions in revenue from Fortune 500 companies eager to optimize their operations. She was Brandon's equal partner in every sense, and she'd never felt more alive, more purposeful, more like she was exactly where she belonged. The first cracks appeared after they closed their Series B funding round. $25 million changed everything, transforming their scrappy startup into a company with serious expectations and even more serious pressure to deliver results. Brandon began talking differently, acting differently, hiring consultants who whispered about scaling challenges and leadership optimization. "We need to professionalize our image," he'd said during what would be their last strategy meeting as equals. "Investors want to see a CEO who's focused, not distracted by having his wife involved in every decision. It sends the wrong message about our corporate governance." Distracted, Sarah had stared at him across their conference table, unable to process what she was hearing. "I built half this company. Our biggest clients came from my campaigns, and I appreciate that. But we're playing in the big leagues now. We need separation between personal and professional. It's better for both of us." Looking back, Sarah realized that was the moment she lost him. Not to another woman, not yet, but to something equally seductive, the image of himself as a Silicon Valley titan. The Brandon who'd proposed in that coffee shop, who'd worked 18-hour days beside her in their garage, had been replaced by someone who saw her as a liability rather than a partner. The changes came gradually, each one presented as a reasonable business decision. Sarah found herself excluded from investor meetings, her marketing decisions questioned by consultants Brandon hired without consulting her, her campaigns subjected to endless revisions by people who'd never built anything from scratch. When she protested, he'd smile that patronizing smile she'd grown to hate and say, "Trust me, babe, I know what I'm doing." The house came next, a $3 million monument to success in the hills of Los Altos, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the San Francisco Bay, and rooms so large their voices echoed. It was beautiful and cold, nothing like the cozy apartment where they'd started their journey together, where they'd stayed up all night planning their future and making love on sheets that smelled like coffee and ambition. "This is just the beginning," Brandon had said as they stood in the marble foyer that cost more than most people made in a year. "Wait until we go public. We'll have houses all over the world. New York, London, maybe a place in Aspen for the winters." But Sarah found herself feeling increasingly isolated in their glass palace. Brandon's work hours stretched longer, often lasting until well past midnight. Business trips became more frequent, taking him to cities she'd never heard of for meetings he couldn't or wouldn't explain. When he was home, he was distant, always on his phone, always somewhere else mentally, always just out of reach. Their conversations became transactional, focused on schedules and logistics rather than dreams and possibilities. The easy intimacy they'd once shared evaporated, replaced by a polite formality that felt worse than outright hostility. He would compliment her dress, but his eyes wouldn't really see her. He would ask about her day, but would be scrolling through emails before she could finish answering. The final blow came 8 months ago. Brandon had waltzed into her office, his office now since she'd been relocated to a smaller space that felt more like a closet than a workspace, with a broad smile and devastating news delivered with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he'd said, settling into the chair across from her desk as if he owned it, which, technically, he did now that the company's legal structure had been optimized by his new team of corporate lawyers. "What conversation?" "About you taking a step back from the company. I think it's time. The board thinks it would be better if family members weren't involved in day-to-day operations. Conflict of interest. You understand, but don't worry, you'll still have your shares you'll be taken care of." The shares that were worth nothing unless the company went public. The shares that could be diluted into insignificance with a simple board vote. She'd built this company alongside him, poured her heart and soul into every campaign, every strategy, every sleepless night, and now she was being discarded like an outdated piece of equipment. "You can't be serious." "It's already decided." "Sarah, clean out your office by Friday. I'll have HR handle the transition." That night, for the first time in their relationship, Brandon had slept in the guest room. He claimed he had early calls with investors in different time zones and didn't want to wake her. But Sarah lay awake in their king-size bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering when exactly she'd become a stranger in her own life, a guest in her own marriage, an outsider in the company she'd helped create. The man she'd married was gone, replaced by someone who saw her as nothing more than a potential liability to be managed and eventually eliminated. The recording equipment was hidden behind a row of business books in Brandon's home office, tucked between volumes on leadership and strategic planning with titles like The Art of War in Business and Winning at All Costs. Sarah might never have found it if she hadn't been looking for their old photo albums to create an anniversary slideshow, a desperate attempt to remind herself of happier times when their love had felt real and unshakable. Instead of memories, she'd found a sophisticated digital recording system, the kind used by private investigators and corporate security firms. Professional-grade microphones, digital storage devices, and software that could isolate voices from background noise and transcribe conversations automatically. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the files on the connected laptop, each folder labeled with clinical precision. Months of conversations, cataloged by date and location. Dinner parties with friends, where every word had been captured and analyzed. Phone calls with her sister, where she'd confided her growing concerns about their marriage. Even therapy sessions they'd attended together, where Dr. Morgan had encouraged them to be more open and honest with each other. Brandon had been recording everything, turning their home into a surveillance state where she was the unwitting subject of constant monitoring. The folder labeled Sarah Legal made her stomach turn. Inside were dozens of audio files, each one cataloged with dates and brief descriptions that read like evidence markers in a criminal case. Sarah discusses feeling isolated, potential evidence of mental instability. Read 1. Sarah admits to having doubts about marriage, possible grounds for abandonment claim. Read another. He wasn't just monitoring her conversations. He was building a legal case, gathering ammunition for a war she didn't even know was being fought. Every moment of vulnerability, every private confession, every expression of doubt or frustration had been weaponized against her. The front door slammed somewhere in the house, the sound echoing through the marble foyer like a gunshot. Sarah quickly closed the laptop, her heart pounding as she heard Brandon's footsteps on the hardwood floors, coming closer to his office with the measured stride of someone who owned everything around him. "Sarah, you in here." She was sitting in his leather chair when he appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit slightly rumpled from another long day at the office building an empire on lies. His eyes immediately went to the recording equipment, clearly visible now that she'd moved the books, then to her face. For a moment, she saw something flicker in his expression, surprise, calculation, and then something that looked almost like relief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had been growing for months, finally visible in all its devastating depth. "How long?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fact that her entire world was crumbling around her. Brandon's mask of surprise was almost convincing, crafted with the same skill he used to deceive investors and employees. "How long what? How long have you been recording me, recording us, recording everything that happens in our home?" He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him with deliberate care, his demeanor shifting from feigned innocence to cold calculation. It was like watching someone remove a mask, revealing the stranger who'd been hiding underneath all along. "I don't know what you're talking about. I found the files. Brandon, months of them. You've been recording everything I say, everywhere I go in this house. You've been building a case against me." "That's for security," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice, no surprise at being discovered. If anything, he seemed almost relieved that the pretense was finally over. "Security, Ishit." Sarah stood up, anger finally breaking through her shock and disbelief. "You recorded our therapy sessions. You recorded me talking to my sister about our problems. You recorded private conversations with my friends. What kind of security is that?" Brandon moved toward his desk, but she was already standing between him and the laptop, between him and the evidence of his betrayal. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncomfortable, off balance, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. "You're being paranoid. Sarah, maybe you should talk to Dr. Morgan about this. These kinds of conspiracy theories can be symptoms of deeper issues." The gaslighting was so blatant, so insulting to her intelligence, that Sarah almost laughed. He was trying to make her doubt her own perceptions, even as the evidence sat right there between them, even as the truth was finally exposed in all its ugly clarity. "I'm being paranoid. You're the one with a spy set up in your own home." "Our home," he corrected, and something in his tone made her blood run cold. "And everything in it belongs to the company, including that equipment. The company doesn't own our personal conversations." "Actually," Brandon said, moving closer with the confidence of someone who'd thought through every angle, "if you check your employment contract, you'll find that any discussions of company business, even in private, are considered proprietary information. I have every right to protect my interests." Her employment contract, the one she'd signed without really reading because she'd trusted him, because she'd believed they were partners building something together. The contract that had probably been carefully crafted to give him exactly this kind of leverage. "Your interests," she repeated slowly, letting the words sink in. "Not our interests, not the company's interests, yours." Same thing. That's when Sarah knew their marriage was over. Not because of another woman, not because of growing apart, but because the man she'd married had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who saw her as a threat to be monitored, controlled, and eventually eliminated. Someone who could look her in the eye and justify turning their home into a prison, their marriage into a surveillance operation. I want you to delete those files, she said. Brandon smiled, and it was the coldest expression she'd ever seen on his face. I don't think so. Brandon, I'm your wife. Yes, he said, settling into the chair behind his desk as if nothing had happened, as if her world hadn't just been shattered. And I'm your husband, which means I'm looking out for your best interests, even when you can't see them yourself. Sarah stared at him, this stranger wearing her husband's face, and realized she was completely alone. In her own home, in her own marriage, she had become the enemy. Everything she thought she knew about their relationship, about their partnership, about their love, had been an illusion carefully maintained to serve his purposes. That night, lying in their bed while he worked late in his office, she started planning her escape. The Instagram post appeared on Sarah's feed like a slap in the face, popping up between pictures of her college friends' children and inspirational quotes about entrepreneurship. Amber Vance, tech influencer and lifestyle blogger with over 200,000 followers, posing on what was unmistakably Brandon's yacht, the same yacht Sarah had helped him pick out 2 years ago, back when they still made decisions together, back when she'd believed they were building a shared future. The caption read, "Perfect weekend with my favorite CEO. Nothing like Silicon Valley sunsets when you're with the right person. Hashtag blessed, hash startup, hash life, hash love." The hashtags felt like additional slaps, each one a deliberate taunt. Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through Amber's feed, each image revealing another piece of a life Sarah didn't recognize. Photo after photo of a parallel existence where she'd been completely erased. Amber at restaurants Sarah had never been to, wearing jewelry Sarah had never seen, traveling to places Brandon claimed were business trips requiring his complete focus and attention. The timeline was devastating. The post went back 18 months, covering the entire period when Brandon had been growing distant and cold, when he'd been working late every night and traveling constantly. While Sarah had been blaming herself for their failing marriage, questioning her own perceptions, wondering what she'd done wrong, Brandon had been living an entirely separate life with someone who looked like she'd stepped off the cover of a tech magazine, a life where Sarah didn't exist. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, though that cut deep enough to leave her gasping. It was the realization that she'd been fighting for a marriage that had already ended. All those nights she'd stayed awake wondering how to fix things. All those therapy sessions where she tried to be more understanding and supportive. All those conversations where she'd asked what she could do differently. She'd been performing emotional CPR on a corpse. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Working late again. Big presentation tomorrow. Don't wait up. Love you." Sarah looked at the timestamp on Amber's latest post. 20 minutes ago, a photo of 2 champagne glasses at an upscale restaurant in Palo Alto, with the caption, "Celebrating new beginnings with someone special." The lies were so casual, so effortless, delivered with the same tone he used to tell her he loved her. Sarah wondered how many times Brandon had looked her in the eye and lied without a flicker of conscience. How many business trips had been romantic getaways? How many late nights at the office had been spent in Amber's bed? How many times had he come home to her, smelling like another woman's perfume, while she convinced herself she was imagining things? She found herself dialing her sister's number before she'd consciously decided to call, her fingers moving automatically while her mind reeled from the implications of what she'd discovered. "Sarah, it's kind of late. Is everything okay?" Michelle's voice was warm and concerned, exactly what Sarah needed to hear. Her younger sister had always been the pragmatic one, the nurse who dealt with life and death situations every day and had no patience for drama or self-pity. If anyone could help her figure out what to do next, it was Michelle. "I found her," Sarah said without preamble, her voice surprisingly steady. "Found who?" "The other woman. Her name is Amber Vance. She's been posting pictures of their relationship on social media for over a year. She's beautiful, young, successful. Everything I'm not anymore." Silence on the other end of the line, followed by a string of creative profanity that would have made their mother reach for the soap. Then, "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. But also, frankly, I'm relieved you finally found proof. I've been worried about you, about the way you've been blaming yourself for everything. I feel like such an idiot. All this time I've been thinking it was my fault, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I wasn't interesting enough, and he's been living with someone else. It's not your fault." Michelle said firmly, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used with difficult patience. None of this is your fault, but what are you going to do about it? That was the question that had been haunting Sarah for months, even before she'd found concrete proof of Brandon's infidelity. What could she do? Brandon controlled everything: the money, the house, the company they'd built together. Sarah had been so focused on being supportive, on being the perfect wife and partner, that she'd gradually signed away her independence, piece by piece. I don't know, Sarah admitted, feeling the weight of her powerlessness settle over her like a suffocating blanket. I don't have anywhere to go. No job, no income of my own. He made sure of that when he forced me out of the company. Then you need to get a lawyer. Today. With what money? Everything is in his name, or the company's name. I don't even have access to our joint accounts anymore. He changed all the passwords last month and said it was for security. Sarah, listen to me. Michelle's voice took on the authoritative tone she used with patients who were giving up hope. You're not helpless. You co-founded that company. You were married to him for 8 years. You have rights, even if he's convinced you otherwise. But the prenup might not be valid if he was hiding assets or planning this before he signed it. You need to talk to someone who knows the law, someone who can protect you. After she hung up, Sarah sat in the dark living room of the house that no longer felt like home, looking out at the lights of Silicon Valley spread below. Somewhere out there, Brandon was with Amber, probably planning Sarah's complete removal from his life. The recorded conversations, the systematic isolation from the company, the financial control, the emotional manipulation. It was all part of a strategy designed to leave her with nothing when he finally decided to discard her. But Michelle was right. Sarah wasn't helpless. She was scared, hurt, and angry. But she wasn't broken, and she was done being a victim in her own life. The next morning, she started looking for a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving wealthy, manipulative spouses. Someone who understood that this wasn't just about dividing assets, it was about survival. Marcus Thompson's law office occupied the top floor of a modest building in downtown San Jose, a deliberate contrast to the gleaming towers where corporate lawyers practice their brand of ruthless capitalism. Sarah had found him through a referral from a women's support group, and his reputation for taking on powerful men in high-stakes divorces preceded him into every courtroom in Silicon Valley. The waiting room was comfortable but not ostentatious, decorated with photos of his family rather than awards and accolades. It felt like the office of someone who understood that divorce was about more than money. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to build a life free from manipulation and control. Mrs. Mitchell, Marcus said, settling behind his desk with a thick file already assembled from the materials she'd sent him. I've reviewed everything you provided, and I have to tell you, this is going to be a complex case. Because of the prenup. Partly, but also because your husband appears to have been planning this divorce for quite some time. The recording equipment, the systematic exclusion from company decisions, the hidden relationship. This isn't a marriage that fell apart. This is a calculated campaign to minimize his losses while maximizing your suffering. Sarah had spent the past week documenting everything she could remember, creating a timeline that revealed the methodical nature of Brandon's campaign against her. Financial irregularities, changes in his behavior, the gradual erosion of her role in the company she'd helped build. The picture that emerged was chilling in its deliberate cruelty. What are my chances? Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression serious but not without hope. Honestly, if we play by his rules, you'll walk away with very little. The prenup is sophisticated, and most of your assets are tied up in company stock that he controls. But if we can prove fraud, concealment of assets, or breach of fiduciary duty, we can challenge the agreement. How do we do that? We need to follow the money. If he's been funneling assets to his girlfriend or hiding income in preparation for divorce, we can claw it back. We also need to document the emotional and financial abuse. The recordings are actually helpful to us. They show premeditation and a pattern of psychological manipulation. Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks, like a candle being lit in a dark room. So we can win. We can fight. Whether we win depends on what we find and how dirty he's willing to play. But I'll warn you, men like your husband don't go down easily. He's going to escalate, and things are going to get worse before they get better. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "We need to talk when you get home. Important discussion about our future." Marcus noticed her expression change as she read the message. "What is it?" "He wants to talk." "Don't. Not without me present. From now on, all communication goes through attorneys. He's had months to prepare for this conversation, and you're just getting started. Every word you say to him is an opportunity for him to manipulate or gather evidence against you." That evening, Sarah returned to the house she'd once loved to find Brandon waiting in the living room with divorce papers and his lawyer, David Peterson, the same man who would later stand in court and accuse her of adultery with the practiced ease of someone who destroyed lives for a living. The scene was carefully orchestrated. Brandon in his favorite chair, looking concerned and reasonable. Peterson with his papers spread across the coffee table like a general planning a campaign. They'd even dimmed the lights to create an atmosphere of intimate conversation rather than legal ambush. "Sarah," Brandon said, his voice artificially warm and concerned, "I think we both know this marriage isn't working. I've prepared a settlement offer that I think you'll find generous." She didn't sit down, didn't acknowledge Peterson's presence, didn't fall into the trap of treating this like a brickenly discussion between equals. "I have an attorney now. He'll be in touch." Brandon's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He'd expected her to be grateful, compliant, eager to accept whatever scraps he offered. The idea that she might fight back clearly hadn't occurred to him. "That's unnecessary. Sarah, we can handle this like adults. No need to drag lawyers into it and make things ugly." "You mean uglier than recording my private conversations, uglier than cheating on me for 18 months, uglier than systematically destroying my career and independence?" Peterson cleared his throat with the practiced ease of someone used to managing difficult situations. "Mrs. Mitchell, my client is prepared to offer you the house and a substantial settlement in exchange for your shares in NextGen Solutions. It's a fair deal that recognizes your contributions to the marriage." Sarah looked at the papers he'd slid across the coffee table. The house that was mortgaged to the hilt and would cost more to maintain than she could afford. The settlement that would barely cover living expenses for 2 years. In exchange for her half of a company worth $50 million and growing. "No, Estelle," "Sarah," Brandon said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd grown to hate. "Be reasonable. You walked away from the company months ago. You can't expect to benefit from work you didn't do. I walked away because you forced me out, and I helped build that company from nothing while you were learning how to code. That's not how the board sees it, or how a court would see it. Then I guess we'll find out." As she headed for the stairs, Brandon called after her, and for the first time she heard real anger in his voice instead of calculated manipulation. "You're making a mistake. Sarah, this offer won't be available forever." She paused at the bottom of the steps, feeling stronger than she had in months. "You're right, it won't be, because when my lawyer is done documenting what you've stolen from me, you'll be offering a lot more." That night, she locked her bedroom door for the first time since they'd moved into the house. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first step toward reclaiming her life. The war had begun, and Sarah was finally ready to fight. The pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines, clear and undeniable despite her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. Sarah stared at it in the bathroom of the small apartment she'd rented after moving out of the house, a cramped space that felt more like home than the marble palace she'd shared with Brandon. 8 weeks. The baby had been conceived right around the time she'd discovered Brandon's affair, during one of their last attempts at intimacy before everything fell apart completely. The irony was almost laughable. She'd been trying to save her marriage while he'd been planning its destruction, and somehow in the middle of all that deception and betrayal, they'd created a life. Her first instinct was panic. How could she handle a divorce and a pregnancy at the same time? How could she fight for her rights while dealing with morning sickness and doctor's appointments and the 1,000 other challenges of bringing a child into the world? Brandon would use this against her, paint her as an unstable woman making desperate decisions to trap him. But as the initial shock wore off, something else emerged. Determination. This baby was hers, regardless of what Brandon did or said, and if she was going to bring a child into the world, She was damn well going to make sure that child had a secure future, free from the manipulation and control that had defined her marriage. Marcus took the news with professional calm, though she could see the wheels turning behind his eyes as he calculated the implications for their case. "This changes things," he said, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "Pregnancy adds another layer of complexity, but it also strengthens your position. California courts are very protective of pregnant women and children. Brandon will probably claim the baby isn't his. Let him. DNA tests are routine now, and they'll prove paternity beyond any doubt. But more importantly, this gives us leverage in settlement negotiations, child support, custody arrangements. He can't just walk away clean anymore." The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made it hard to focus on the legal complexities of her divorce, emotional swings that left her crying over commercials and legal documents with equal intensity. The stress of fighting Brandon while growing his child felt like trying to run a marathon while carrying a weight that grew heavier every day. Sarah felt the baby move for the first time during a particularly brutal deposition session. Brandon's lawyers were trying to establish that she'd been mentally unstable during the marriage, using carefully edited clips from the recordings Brandon had made. They played her voice back to her own words about feeling isolated and confused, twisted into evidence of psychological breakdown. "Mrs. Mitchell," Peterson said with false concern, his voice dripping with the kind of sympathy that felt more like an insult. "In this recording from March 15th, you tell your sister that you feel like you're going crazy. Can you explain what you meant by that?" "I meant that my husband was secretly recording my conversations and gaslighting me about our relationship. I felt crazy because I was being systematically manipulated and made to doubt my own perceptions." "Or you felt crazy because you were having an affair and experiencing guilt about deceiving your husband." "Objection," Marcus said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Speculation and harassment. Sustained," said the mediator. But the damage was already done. They were building a narrative where Sarah was the unstable, unfaithful wife trying to trap her successful husband with a questionable pregnancy. The fact that she'd been excluded from the company, isolated from friends, and psychologically abused was being reframed as evidence of her own mental instability. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah felt the flutter of movement in her abdomen. It was gentle, barely perceptible, like butterflies made of hope. But it reminded her why she was fighting, not just for herself, but for the innocent life growing inside her, for the child who deserved better than a father who could look a room full of lawyers in the eye and lie without conscience. The mediation process stretched for months, each session more brutal than the last. Brandon's team seemed determined to destroy not just her financial claims, but her reputation, her sense of self, her belief in her own memories and perceptions. They questioned every decision she'd made, every emotion she'd expressed, every moment of vulnerability she'd shown during their marriage. But gradually, Marcus began to build their counter case. Financial records showing suspicious transfers to shell companies, expert testimony about the psychological effects of long-term gaslighting, evidence of Brandon's systematic campaign to isolate and control her. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd been systematically abused by someone who was supposed to love and protect her. The mediation seemed to be going well. Brandon's side was clearly eager to settle out of court, probably to avoid the public scrutiny that would come with a trial. After weeks of negotiations that felt like trench warfare, they reached an agreement that felt like a victory. Sarah would receive $20 million, a significant portion of Brandon's liquid assets, plus ongoing child support that would ensure her child never wanted for anything. In exchange, she would relinquish all claims to Next Gen Solutions and agree to a confidentiality clause that would prevent her from discussing the details of their marriage or divorce. "It's a good deal," Marcus assured her as they reviewed the final paperwork in his office. "You'll be financially secure for life, and your child will have everything they need. More importantly, you'll be free from Brandon's control forever." Sarah signed the papers with a sense of relief so profound it felt like being released from prison. Finally, she could move on with her life. The baby was due in 3 months, and she was already looking at houses, planning for a future that didn't include Brandon's manipulation and control. The settlement funds were supposed to be transferred within 48 hours. Sarah had already put a deposit down on a house, a warm, welcoming place with a garden where her child could play safely. She'd started shopping for nursery furniture, imagining the life she would build for her son or daughter. Then the FBI showed up at her door. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Agent Rebecca Chen with the Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk to you about Next-Gen Solutions and your ex-husband." The world tilted as Sarah invited the agents into her apartment. They spread documents across her kitchen table. Documents that told a story she'd never suspected. A truth so devastating it made her previous betrayals look like minor deceptions. "Your husband has been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme," Agent Chen explained, her voice gentle but implacable. "The company's revolutionary supply chain software, it doesn't exist. Never did. He's been using new investor money to pay returns to early investors while funneling millions into personal accounts." Sarah stared at the evidence spread across her table like the wreckage of her life. Fake demonstration videos that looked convincing, but showed software that was never built. Bribed beta testers who provided glowing testimonials for products they'd never used. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands designed to hide money stolen from investors who'd believed in Brandon's vision. The man she'd married, the brilliant entrepreneur she'd helped build a company with, was nothing more than a sophisticated con artist who'd fooled everyone, including her. "The $20 million he just agreed to pay you," Agent Chen continued, her expression sympathetic but firm. "That's stolen money. We're freezing all of his assets pending investigation. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell, but your settlement is worthless." Sarah sank into her chair, one hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. She'd thought she'd won. She'd thought she'd secured her child's future. Instead, she'd discovered that everything were right. Her marriage, her company, her financial security had been built on lies so elaborate they'd fooled some of the smartest investors in Silicon Valley. And now she had to start over from nothing, with a baby on the way and legal bills she couldn't pay. The game had changed again. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who couldn't meet Sarah's eyes as he handed over the papers. 30 days to vacate the apartment she could no longer afford, now that her settlement had vanished along with Brandon's hidden assets and her faith in the possibility of justice. "Ma'am," the deputy said quietly, his voice filled with the kind of compassion that came from delivering bad news to people who didn't deserve it. "There are resources available, shelters, assistance programs. You don't have to go through this alone." Shelters? Sarah Michelle Mitchell, who 6 months ago had lived in a $3 million house and co-owned a $50 million company, was being directed to homeless shelters. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so devastating. The media had found the story by then, drawn by the combination of Silicon Valley glamour and spectacular downfall that made for perfect clickbait. "Tech CEO's pregnant wife left destitute after fraud charges," read the headline in the San Jose Mercury News. The article included a photo of Sarah leaving court, her hand protectively covering her 8-month pregnant belly, her face drawn with exhaustion and stress. The comments section was brutal. People who'd never met her felt qualified to judge her choices, her marriage, her decision to trust the man she'd loved. Some blamed her for not seeing the signs of Brandon's fraud. Others suggested she was complicit, that she must have known about the schemes that had funded their lifestyle. A few expressed sympathy, but they were drowned out by the chorus of judgment and speculation. Brandon, meanwhile, had vanished like smoke. Released on bail pending trial, he disappeared along with Amber Vance and whatever liquid assets the FBI hadn't managed to freeze. Rumors placed them in Costa Rica, or maybe Thailand, living off money hidden in accounts investigators hadn't found yet. The man who'd once proclaimed his love for her had abandoned his pregnant wife and unborn child without a backward glance. Sarah's parents offered to help, but they were retired teachers in Ohio with their own financial struggles and health problems. Her father was dealing with early-stage Parkinson's, and her mother was his primary caregiver. Her sister Michelle sent what she could from her nurse's salary, but it wasn't enough to cover legal fees and living expenses for someone about to become a single mother in one of the most expensive areas in the country. The worst part wasn't the financial stress, devastating as it was. The worst part was the silence from people she'd thought were friends. The Silicon Valley social circle that had embraced her when she was married to a successful CEO had evaporated the moment the fraud charges became public. Former colleagues who'd sought her advice on marketing strategies. Dinner party companions who'd shared intimate secrets over wine. Women she'd considered close friends. None of them returned her calls. She was toxic now, associated with scandal and failure in a culture that worships success above all else. Marcus had been forced to withdraw from her case when she could no longer pay his retainer. The court-appointed attorney who replaced him was well-meaning but overworked, juggling dozens of cases and unable to give her situation the attention it needed. Sarah Davis was competent but overwhelmed, fighting a system designed to favor those who could afford the best representation. Mrs. Mitchell, Attorney Davis said during their brief consultation in a cramped office that smelled like coffee and desperation. I have to be honest with you. The federal investigation has frozen everything. Even if we could prove you deserve a larger settlement, there's nothing to settle with. Your best bet is to focus on child support once your husband is located and prosecuted. If he's located, the FBI is very good at what they do. But these cases can take years to resolve. And there's no guarantee they'll recover enough assets to make you whole. Years. Sarah's hand moved to her belly, where the baby seemed to sense her distress with increased kicks and movement. She couldn't wait years. She needed stability, security, a way to support her child now. The contractions started that night, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Sarah woke at 2 a.m. to a sharp pain that took her breath away, followed by another 20 minutes later. She lay in the dark for an hour, timing the contractions with an app on her phone, trying to convince herself it was false labor. But the pains grew stronger, more regular, and she finally called an ambulance because she had no one else to call. No partner to drive her to the hospital, no family nearby to hold her hand, no friends left who would answer their phones at 3 in the morning. The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear, not just physical pain, though that was intense enough to make her cry out with each contraction, but the deeper ache of facing this moment alone. She'd always imagined having a baby would be a joyful experience shared with someone who loved her. Instead, she was surrounded by strangers in a sterile ambulance, racing through empty streets toward an uncertain future. Ma'am, we're almost there, the paramedic said, checking her blood pressure again. Everything's going to be fine. You're doing great. But Sarah knew that wasn't true. Nothing was fine. Her husband was a criminal who'd fled the country. Her company was a fraud. Her settlement was worthless. She was about to become a single mother with no income, no home, no support system, and no idea how she was going to provide for the child she was about to bring into the world. At the hospital, the nurses were kind but busy, dealing with multiple emergencies on the maternity ward. Sarah labored through the night alone, breathing through contractions while trying not to think about how she was going to pay the hospital bill that was accumulating with every hour. Is there anyone we can call? A nurse asked during a brief break between contractions. The baby's father, family members, friends. No, Sarah managed between gasps, the admission feeling like another kind of labor pain. There's no one. It was the lowest point of her life, lying in that hospital bed at dawn, exhausted and alone, waiting to bring a child into a world where she couldn't even guarantee him a roof over his head. But sometimes the darkest hour really is just before dawn. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes the very thing that seems like your greatest weakness becomes your greatest strength. The knock on her hospital room door came just as Sarah was trying to figure out how to fill out the birth certificate paperwork with hands that shook from exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. She looked up to see a distinguished older man in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, his face bearing the kind of weathered authority that came from decades of making difficult decisions. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Frank Mitchell, Brandon's father. Sarah's first instinct was to call security. Frank Mitchell had built the family fortune that Brandon had eventually inherited and squandered. A self-made man who'd turned a small construction company into a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire. He was part of the same world that had rejected her, probably here to gloat or make demands about his grandson, or to somehow blame her for his son's spectacular downfall. But something in his expression stopped her from reaching for the call button. He looked tired, older than his 68 years, and there was none of the cold arrogance she'd come to associate with the Mitchell family. Instead, he looked like a man carrying a burden he could barely support. I know you have no reason to trust me, he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. But I'd like to talk to you about Brandon, about what he's done, and about how I might be able to help. Help, Sarah shifted the sleeping baby in her arms. This tiny perfect person who'd entered the world just hours ago, completely unaware of the chaos that surrounded his birth. Your son stole millions of dollars and left me homeless. What kind of help are you offering? Frank pulled a chair closer to her bed and sat down heavily, his movements betraying the weight of whatever he'd come to tell her. The kind that comes with a full confession and a very large check. Over the next hour, Frank Mitchell told Sarah a story that reframed everything she thought she knew about her marriage, Brandon's crimes, and the forces that had shaped the man who'd destroyed her life. It was a story of suspicion, investigation, and a father's growing horror at what his son had become. I suspected something was wrong 18 months ago, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Brandon was asking for more and more money, claiming expansion costs and development expenses that didn't make sense for a software company. When I tried to visit NextGen to see this revolutionary technology everyone was talking about, he always had excuses. Meetings were canceled, demonstrations were postponed. Why didn't you say anything? Because he's my son, and I wanted to believe him. But I also wasn't stupid. I hired a private investigator to look into NextGen's finances. Frank reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. What we found was alarming, but not as alarming as what we found about Brandon's personal life. Frank opened the folder to reveal photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports that painted a picture of systematic deception. Everything's in here. The fake customer testimonials, the shell companies, the investor meetings where he showed software that didn't exist, but also evidence of his relationship with Amber Vance, and more importantly, evidence of how he systematically isolated and financially abused you. Sarah stared at the folder, hardly daring to hope that someone had finally seen through Brandon's carefully constructed lies. Why are you telling me this? Because my son destroyed lives to fund his lifestyle, and you were his first victim. Because that baby you're holding is my grandson, and I'll be damned if he grows up in poverty while his father lives like a king on stolen money. Frank opened another folder, this one containing legal documents that looked official and expensive. I've been working with the FBI for the past 6 months, helping them build their case against Brandon. In exchange for my cooperation and testimony, they've agreed to unfreeze certain assets that can be traced directly to my family's legitimate businesses. What does that mean? It means I'm in a position to offer you something Brandon never could: real financial security, not stolen investor money, but clean funds from companies I built before my son was old enough to ruin them. Sarah looked down at her baby, this innocent child who deserves so much better than the chaos his father had created. What do you want in exchange? Nothing, Frank said quietly. And for the first time, Sarah heard genuine emotion in his voice. Except maybe the chance to be a grandfather to that little boy. If you'll let me, and the opportunity to make sure Brandon faces the consequences of what he's done. It was almost too good to be true, and Sarah had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. But Frank's documents were thorough, his legal team was legitimate, and when FBI agents arrived later that day, they confirmed that his cooperation had been invaluable to their investigation. Mr. Mitchell has been extremely helpful, Agent Chen explained, her demeanor much warmer than during their previous meeting. His testimony and financial records will be crucial in securing a conviction when we apprehend Brandon. Soon, we've tracked him to Costa Rica, and we have extradition agreements in place. Your ex-husband's vacation is about to end very abruptly. Frank reached into his briefcase one more time and pulled out a cashier's check that made Sarah's eyes widen. This is just the beginning, he said. There's more where that came from, enough to ensure you and Andrew never have to worry about money again. Andrew, Sarah looked down at her son, the name feeling right in a way that nothing had felt right for months. His name is Andrew, after my grandfather. Andrew Mitchell, Frank said softly, reaching out to gently touch the baby's hand. He's perfect. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Not just for financial security, but for justice, for family, for the possibility that her son might grow up knowing that sometimes, even when everything seems lost, people surprise you with their capacity for decency. Sometimes the very people you expect to abandon you turn out to be your salvation. And sometimes family means more than the person who shares your DNA. The courtroom was packed 6 months later when Brandon was finally brought back to face charges that would determine whether justice was just a word or an actual force in the world. Sarah sat in the front row, baby Andrew sleeping peacefully in her arms, flanked by Frank Mitchell and Marcus Thompson, who'd resumed representation now that she could pay his fees and then some. Brandon looked different, and not just because of the orange jumpsuit that had replaced his designer suits. He was thinner, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his face bearing the haunted look of someone who'd finally run out of places to hide. The confident tech CEO who'd once commanded boardrooms was gone, replaced by a desperate man facing federal fraud charges that could put him away for decades. Amber Vance was nowhere to be seen. According to news reports that had followed their capture in Costa Rica, she'd abandoned Brandon the moment the FBI found them, cutting a deal to testify against him in exchange for immunity. The woman who'd smiled so smugly in divorce court, who'd posted Instagram photos of their stolen luxury, had vanished like smoke the instant her lifestyle was threatened. She was testifying via video link from an undisclosed location, her face carefully hidden to protect her from the media circus that surrounded the trial. The defendant stole over $40 million from investors, the prosecutor announced to the jury, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. But his crimes didn't start with financial fraud. They began with the systematic abuse and manipulation of his own wife, the woman who helped him build the very company he used to perpetrate his crimes. Sarah was called to testify about the recording equipment, the psychological manipulation, the way Brandon had isolated her from the business she'd helped create. It was painful to relive those memories in public, but also cathartic. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, the truth was being told in a forum where it mattered, where it could lead to consequences. Mrs. Mitchell, the defense attorney, said during cross-examination, "Isn't it true that you benefited financially from your husband's success for years before these alleged crimes?" "I benefited from the success of a company I helped build," Sarah replied firmly, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "When that company turned out to be fraudulent, I lost everything, just like the other victims." "But you're not exactly destitute now, are you? Your father-in-law has been very generous." Sarah looked across the courtroom at Frank, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Mitchell chose to help his grandson have a stable life. That's his choice to make. And it doesn't change what his son did to me or to the investors who trusted him." The prosecution played recordings of Brandon's conversations with investors, meetings where he'd promised revolutionary technology that didn't exist. They showed fake demonstration videos, forged customer testimonials, and financial records that revealed the elaborate shell game he'd been playing with other people's money. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd built an empire on lies so sophisticated they'd fooled some of the smartest people in Silicon Valley. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Amber herself, appearing on screen from her undisclosed location, her face partially obscured but her voice clear and unrepentant. "Brandon told me he was getting divorced anyway," she said when asked about their relationship. "He said his wife was mentally unstable and that he needed to protect his assets from her harm. I believed him because he was so convincing, so confident. He made it seem like he was the victim." The prosecutor pressed her on the timeline. "When did Mr. Mitchell first discuss divorcing his wife?" "Almost 2 years ago. He said he was planning it carefully, that he needed to document her instability and protect the company from her interference. He made it sound like she was trying to destroy what he'd built." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and a dozen other charges, Sarah felt a weight she'd been carrying for 2 years finally lift from her shoulders. Brandon was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. During the sentencing hearing, he was given the opportunity to speak, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flicker of the man she'd once loved. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I can't undo the harm I've caused. I betrayed my investors, my employees, and most of all, my wife and son. I let greed and ambition corrupt everything good in my life." He turned to look at Sarah, and for just a moment, she saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Sarah, I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. but I hope someday you can help our son understand that his father wasn't always the man who stands before this court today." Sarah said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The man she'd married was gone, had probably been gone for years before she'd finally seen through his lies. This broken person in an orange jumpsuit was a stranger who happened to share her son's DNA. As Brandon was led away in shackles, Sarah felt Andrew stir in her arms. He opened his eyes and looked up at her with that perfect trust that only babies possess, completely unaware of the drama that had shaped his first months of life. "It's over," Frank said quietly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You can focus on building a future now." And that's exactly what she did. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of her new home, watching 3-year-old Andrew play with wooden blocks on the carpet, while morning sunlight streamed through windows that looked out on a garden she'd planted herself. The house was smaller than the glass palace she'd once shared with Brandon, but it was warm and comfortable, filled with laughter and love instead of recording equipment and lies. She'd used Frank's gift wisely, investing in a small marketing consultancy that specialized in helping fraud victims rebuild their businesses and reputations. It wasn't the glamorous Silicon Valley lifestyle she'd once known, but it was honest work that made a difference in people's lives. Work that helped her sleep peacefully at night, knowing she'd earned every dollar. "Mama, look," Andrew held up a tower of blocks, his face beaming with the kind of pure joy that made all the struggle worthwhile. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling down to admire his creation. He had Brandon's eyes and her stubborn chin, but his personality was entirely his own, curious, gentle, quick to laugh, untouched by the bitterness that had consumed his father. The doorbell rang, and Sarah opened it to find Marcus Thompson with a legal folder and a smile that had become familiar over the past 2 years. "Good news," he said, settling into her living room while Andrew climbed onto his lap with the easy familiarity of a child who'd known him since birth. The appeals court upheld Brandon's conviction. He'll serve all 15 years, and the restitution fund is finally being distributed to victims. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, vindication, but also sadness for the man Brandon had once been, before greed and narcissism had poisoned everything good in his life. "There's something else," Marcus continued, pulling out another document. "You're entitled to a significant portion of the restitution as his primary victim, $8 million. Sarah sat down heavily, the number almost incomprehensible after years of financial struggle. Even after everything Brandon had put her through, the money felt strange, like accepting compensation for a life that could never truly be restored. "I want to set up a foundation," she said without hesitation, "for people who've been financially abused by spouses or partners, legal aid, counseling, temporary housing, everything I wish I'd had when I was going through this." Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd watched his client transform from victim to survivor to advocate. "I think that's exactly what Brandon's victims would want their money used for." That evening, Sarah walked through her garden while Andrew napped, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. She'd lost everything: her marriage, her company, her financial security, her faith in the man she'd loved. But in losing everything, she'd found something more valuable: her own strength, her capacity to survive and rebuild, her ability to create something meaningful from the wreckage of her old life. The woman who'd fainted in that courtroom 3 years ago had been broken by betrayal and lies. The woman who stood in this garden now had been forged by adversity into something unbreakable. She'd learned that she could survive anything, that she could build a life on truth instead of illusion, that she could trust her own perceptions even when everyone around her insisted she was wrong. Her phone buzzed with a text from Frank, picking up Andrew for zoo trip tomorrow. Wear old clothes, we're feeding the giraffes. Again. Sarah smiled. Frank had become the grandfather Andrew deserved, patient and loving, nothing like the cold businessman she'd expected. Their relationship had taught her that families could be chosen as well as inherited, that sometimes the people who save you are the ones you least expect. She'd even started dating again, slowly and carefully, with a man named David who worked as a counselor for domestic violence survivors. He understood her caution, her need to move slowly, her determination to protect Andrew from any relationship that wasn't built on complete honesty and respect. As the sun set over Silicon Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. She'd thought her story was about betrayal and loss, but it had turned out to be about something else entirely: resilience, redemption, and the extraordinary capacity of the human heart to heal and grow stronger. Brandon was serving his sentence in federal prison, learning too late that no amount of money could buy back the life he'd thrown away. Amber had disappeared into obscurity, her influence, her career destroyed by association with his crimes. But Sarah was here, in her garden, with her son sleeping safely upstairs and her future bright with possibility. She'd survived the worst that life could throw at her, and she'd emerged stronger, wiser, and infinitely more grateful for the simple blessings of an honest life. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the greatest gifts, forcing us to discover strength we never knew we possessed. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out who we really are. And sometimes when a pregnant woman faints in court and the mistress smiles, it's not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a much better one.